So today, we're going to dive into the history of the United States. And let me tell you, it is a journey that's way more surprising and, well, contradictory than you might think. This isn't some straight line of steady progress. Nope. It's more like the story of a nation that's always reinventing itself, you know? Sometimes pulling off the impossible, and other times, well, clashing head-on with its own biggest ideas.
So that really brings us to the big question, right? The one we're going to tackle today. How in the world did we get from there to here? I mean, how did a little handful of colonies, just kind of clinging to the edge of a massive continent, turn into the most powerful nation on the planet? The answer? Well, it's a messy story of unity and division, of big dreams and some really harsh realities.
And really, the whole story is defined by this one central tension. You've got the national motto on one side, E pluribus unum, from many, one. It's this beautiful, powerful idea of unity. But then, on the other side, you've got a history that's just full of these deep, sometimes really violent divisions. And that, right there, is what we're calling the American paradox. So, to really get a handle on this paradox, we've got to go back, and I mean way back. Not to 1776, not even to Columbus. We're talking thousands of years earlier, to a land that was already humming with its own stories, its own civilizations, a land that was, well, anything but empty.
So, get this. When Europeans first showed up in 1492, North America wasn't this empty, untouched wilderness you see in the movies. Not at all. It was a bustling continent, home to over 8 million people. I'm talking about incredibly diverse civilizations. You had whale hunters out west, and then down south you had the Hohokam, who built almost 1,000 kilometers of canals. This was a fully populated, highly developed world.
And Columbus's arrival, wow, it set off this monumental clash of worlds. We call it the Columbian Exchange. And sure, it brought some things we can't imagine life without today. Think tomatoes to Italy, potatoes to Ireland, corn spreading across Asia. But it also brought something absolutely devastating: disease. The native peoples had zero immunity to things like smallpox. And the result? Their populations were just decimated. Some estimates say 50 to 90 million people died across the Americas. It's a demographic collapse that has no equal in all of human history. Just staggering.
All right, let's jump forward now to the 18th century. This is where a new nation gets forged in the fire of revolution. And it's built on this incredibly powerful idea, an idea that was, right from the start, also deeply paradoxical.
And here it is. This is the foundational ideal of the United States, a truly radical idea for its time, written by Thomas Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence. He's basically saying that your rights don't come from a king or a queen, they're something you're born with. That's a game changer.
Okay, so here's where we hit that paradox, and I mean, we hit it hard. The very same man who wrote those incredible words, Thomas Jefferson, he enslaved over 600 people in his lifetime. And this wasn't just, a personal failing. This was the central, massive, unresolved conflict that was baked right into the foundation of the brand new nation.
So, how did they even manage that contradiction? Well, it all came down to compromises. Deals. You had the Great Compromise, which sorted out the fight between big states and small states over representation. Pretty standard stuff. But then there was the 3/5 Compromise. And this was, to put it mildly, a lot more controversial. It was a deal to address slavery by literally counting each enslaved person as 3/5 of a human being for the purpose of representation. What did that do? It gave the southern states a lot more power in Congress, power based on a population they held in bondage. It was a deeply troubling deal, but they saw it as the only way to hold the fragile union together.
But here's the thing about those compromises. They didn't solve the problem. Not even close. It was like putting a Band-Aid on a gaping wound. They just kicked the can down the road. And that central contradiction, slavery in a land of freedom, it was a ticking time bomb that was eventually going to tear the whole thing apart.
And for decades, that's exactly what you saw. American politics was just this series of frantic, desperate attempts to keep the peace. Look at this timeline. You see one compromise after another. The Missouri Compromise, the Compromise of 1850, the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Each one was just another temporary fix, another attempt to delay the inevitable. But all it really did was build up more pressure, making the final explosion even bigger. And then, in 1858, a couple of years before he even became president, Abraham Lincoln just came out and said what everyone was thinking but was too afraid to say out loud. A house divided against itself cannot stand. He saw it clearly. The paradox was no longer sustainable. The country had to choose. It had to become one thing or the other.
It couldn't be both anymore.
And the cost of finally settling that question, my gosh, it was just unimaginable. We're talking about 750,000 soldiers dead. To put that in perspective, that's more American lives lost than in every other war the U.S. has ever fought combined. It was an absolutely brutal, bloody war that would forever change what the country was.
But then, out of the ashes of that war, something incredible happened. The United States didn't just rebuild, it exploded. It entered this era of just unbelievable growth that turned it from a broken farming nation into an absolute industrial titan.
And this chart right here just shows you the insane speed and scale of it all. I mean, look at that. In just over 40 years, the U.S. goes from making less than a quarter of the world's stuff to over a third of it. This was the Gilded Age, the age of steel, of coast-to-coast railroads, of skyscrapers reaching for the clouds.
But who built all this? Well, millions and millions of immigrants who came here chasing the promise of a better life. And this quote from an Italian immigrant, it just captures their reality perfectly. The American dream was powerful, but the reality for so many was just back-breaking labor.
Yeah, because behind all those incredible economic numbers was a pretty staggering human cost. I mean, just look at this. We're talking 12-hour days, 7 days a week, no safety regulations to speak of. Child labor was totally common, and the conditions, they were just brutal. Over 1,000 railroad brakemen died every single year. This whole era of incredible progress, it was built on the sweat and sometimes the lives of ordinary people.
So, with all this new industrial muscle, it was pretty much inevitable that the United States was going to get pushed onto the world stage. The days of staying out of everyone else's business, well, those were over. It was time for a new global role.
And boy, did the first half of the 20th century change everything. You know, America kind of dragged its feet into World War I. But by the time World War II was over, it was the undisputed dominant economic and military power on the entire planet, the leader of a whole new world order. Staying isolated just wasn't an option anymore.
And with all that new power came a brand new and frankly terrifying paradox. The United States now had the atomic bomb. On one hand, that offered this feeling of ultimate security, right? But on the other, during the Cold War, and especially during the Cuban Missile Crisis, that very same weapon brought the entire world to the brink of nuclear war. America's greatest strength had somehow become the single greatest threat to its own survival and everyone else's. So even while the U.S. is leading the free world overseas, it still had to deal with what Lincoln once called its unfinished business right here at home. That promise of equality from 1776? Yeah, that struggle was about to hit a whole new and very decisive chapter.
And this was a revolution that wasn't really led by presidents or politicians. It was driven by ordinary people. You can see the milestones here. It starts with challenging segregated schools and Brown versus Board of Education, then the Montgomery bus boycott, the huge March on Washington. These were acts of just incredible courage, and they forced the nation to finally look at the massive gap between its promise of equality and the ugly reality of segregation. And it worked, leading to those landmark laws, the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act.
Which brings us, more or less, to today. And the thing is, the American experiment is, well, it's far from over. The nation is now grappling with a whole new set of really complex challenges. You've got everything from terrorism and climate change to intense political polarization and economic inequality right here at home. And every single one of these things is testing those founding ideals all over again. So that leaves us with this final thought, this big question, the American paradox, right? That constant tug of war between the ideal of unity from many one and the reality of all our divisions. That's not just some story from a history book. It's the central, living, breathing question that the country has to keep trying to answer today and into the future.